contradictions to what I say. No, but we'll open it up soon for questions and answers afterwards. Just a few announcements. This week is going to be the last week of classes. So today is Maimonides. Tomorrow is Everyday Ethics. Wednesday is going to be Jewish Psychology. And Thursday, which was going to be the final class of the season, is going to be Medical Ethics. All classes besides for today's class are in the morning at 9:30 till about 10:30. If for whatever reason you missed any classes and you would like to listen to them, almost all the classes are posted on our website, so you can check it up there. That's cocweb.org, Chabad of Chautauqua web.org. And on the home page, it says to access past classes. Somewhere in the middle of the page, you click, will bring you to a registration page, and from there you get access to all our past classes, and each class has the title. It has the source sheet you can download, and then you can watch it on the page, or you can click and go to YouTube there. Okay, so today is Maimonides. It's the final class on Maimonides for the season. I want to say that today's class is sponsored by Eliana Bar Shalom in memory of her late husband, Jerry Schaefer, who was, I believe, a psychologist by profession, a philosopher, and a dedicated, loyal participant in our classes at Chautauqua. Every summer they would come for about a week, I believe, or maybe 2 weeks. And every morning he would join us and we would have discussions afterwards. And so she and her family sponsored today's class in his memory. And thank you, Eliana, for that. Okay, so we have been discussing Maimonides for now. It's already 7 weeks. This is the 8th week. Let me just give a brief background for those that are new and a brief summary of what we're going to be talking about. So Maimonides was born in the year 1135, or according to some, in the year 1138. He was born in Cordoba, Spain. Fast forward, he passes away in 1205 in Egypt, and he is actually buried in Israel in the city of Tiberias. You can go visit his gravesite if you ever visit Israel, in the city of Tiberias. Maimonides, without going into many details of his life, we're just going to talk about his writings for a minute, because I believe that's what makes him, from the more famous Jewish scholars historically. Maimonides wrote extensively. And he actually began writing in his young years, in his teenage years. And what's fascinating is that his writings of his teenage years are considered today in rabbinic circles authoritative. So that gives you a little bit of an understanding of the level of Maimonides. Maimonides was also, in addition to being a scholar, a Jewish scholar, he was also a physician, and eventually he became the chief physician in the Sultan's palace in Egypt. So Maimonides wrote in many areas, and generally you can divide his writing into 5 categories. The first is his commentary on the Talmud, known as Pirusha Mishnayot LaRambam. What's fascinating about Maimonides, as I mentioned other times, is that in addition to writing in Hebrew, as most Jewish scholars historically have written, he actually wrote in Arabic as well. And so I think that's what gave exposure to many of his writings. And so his commentary to the Talmud was written actually in Arabic, and what we have today is a translation. We have the original Arabic as well, but I believe that most of us don't know that Arabic. And so what we have is a translation. The next body of work is his codification of Jewish law, known as Mishnah Torah. That's 18 volumes. That was written in Hebrew, very basic Hebrew. The objective of that body of work was to make Jewish law and its practice applicable to everybody. And therefore, he wanted it to be written in a very simplified and organized way. For that reason, he only wrote down the actual laws. He eliminated all the different opinions. So he basically based on certain principles, records only what he understands to be the actual halakha, the actual law as to be followed. And he also removed all the rationales that go into, that are behind the law, that go into formulating the law, again, because he wanted to make it accessible to all. What's interesting is that for this reason, Maimonides faced opposition within the Jewish community. One of the reasons, I should say, because they felt that you can't apply law without understanding the rationale and the intent of the law, because there are so many variables, and if you apply the law without understanding its intent, you might misunderstand its objective and therefore apply it erroneously and so on. But eventually this became, again, an authoritative body of work that is studied in all rabbinic academias until today. Actually, today, it's accepted in most rabbinic colleges that the dean of the college will give a weekly, I shouldn't call it a sermon, but a weekly class. It's actually a very in-depth lecture. And almost all base their lecture on Maimonides, trying to find contradictions and trying to reconcile the contradictions in Maimonides' writings. The third body of work is his Guide to the Perplexed, which is a philosophical and theological body of work. That was also written in Arabic. That was actually written as a letter to one of his prize students, Joseph, his name was, who had different confusions, questions, and over the course of, I'm not sure exactly how long, he wrote this body of work, which contains really three parts, or three books to it, which is compiled into one larger book. And it deals with, again, theological questions, scriptural questions, more broader theological questions, faith questions, and so on and so forth. That he wrote in his mid-40s. Then we have the fourth body of work is Maimonides' Responsa. Maimonides was considered the leader of Sephardic Jewry, meaning in addition to being the local rabbi and the dean of the local school and the physician and everything else that he was occupied with, people viewed him as the authority for Sephardic Jewry, and therefore many communities from Yemen to Syria to others would, when their local rabbinic courts or rabbis were not able to address their concerns, they would write to Maimonides. And they include communal issues, personal issues, civil issues, criminal issues, theological issues, and so on, that we have many of these bodies of works. And finally, the fifth body of work is his medical writings. Maimonides was a physician, and as such he wrote, and that's of course written in Arabic as well. So what we're going to do today is what we've already started in the last 2 weeks. Now, some of you weren't here in the past, which is fine. You don't have to, we'll give you a little bit of a summary. But we're going to continue on a subject that we started for the past 2 weeks. And its primary focus is in two areas of Maimonides' writings. One is Mishnah Torah, his codification of Jewish law, and the other is the Guide to the Perplexed, as well as a little bit in his commentary to the Talmud as well. And the subject that we've been discussing in the last few weeks is the seeming contradiction between two basic tenets of Judaism. On one hand, one of the foundations of faith, one of the fundamentals as Maimonides codifies it, is the belief in free choice. The fact that we are responsible for the choices that we make, and our choices breed the consequences, whether as known as reward or punishment, but whether positive or negative. And that's, a fundamental to Judaism, as Maimonides puts it in his codification of Jewish law. If there's no free choice, then why does God send prophets? So why did he send in the past prophets? To warn the people and to encourage them or to threaten them. If anyways, everything is predetermined. So obviously free choice is one of the foundations of religion, definitely of Judaism, as well as the consequences. And on the other hand, we have one of the tenets of Judaism is that God is infinite, God is all-knowing, and not just knowing as a result of what we do, but God actually knows everything before we do it. And so they seem to be a contradiction in nature. If God already knows in advance what's going to happen, and his knowledge is perfect, which means he can't make a mistake, then what we do is basically already predetermined. If we're going to do something that he didn't know, then his knowledge is not perfect. And if we have to do what he knew already, then where's the free choice? So that was really the question that we discussed in the past. And there's another question we also discussed. I'm not going to get into it now, not to get distracted. And what we discussed last week is Maimonides' approach and how he answers or doesn't answer the question and why he says that. And today I want to address how those that oppose Maimonides, how they would address the question and the questions that they would have on Maimonides. So let me summarize briefly what we spoke about last week, Maimonides' approach, and then see what the issues are and how to address those issues. So the point was that many answer this seeming contradiction in what they term a very simplified answer, which is that if we assume that God knows as a result of what we do, then there's no question, right? The whole question of God knowing before and therefore predetermining our choice is if God knows before we did it, and then we do what we do, then we make our choices, then it's a contradiction. But if we can assume that God knows as a result, meaning technically after we do, he knows because we chose, then there's no question. Then his knowledge, it doesn't determine our choice, but on the contrary, our choice determines his knowledge. The problem you have is then how did he know before, right? If the whole point was that everything is foreseen. So to answer that sort of, that part of the question, the answer is that God is not limited by the constraints of time. Now, it's hard for us to fathom what that means, but we can definitely intellectually understand that God is the creator of time, and therefore he's not constrained by the limitation of time. And therefore the whole question of before and after, past, present, and future is a concept that doesn't exist in God's reality. In God's reality, everything is constantly present. And therefore God knows as a result of what we do, although in our constraint of time, it seems it comes out to be before. But in God, there is no such a thing as before or after, and therefore he knows it always. But it's really a knowledge that's a result of our action. That is the simplified answer to this question. Okay, so it's hard to wrap our mind around being beyond time. That's true. And I'm not trying to oversimplify that. But the concept of knowing as a result of our action, and therefore such a knowledge doesn't determine the action, but on the contrary, the action, the choice determines the knowledge, that is a simplified answer. That is easy to understand. That's the way we all know. We know as a result of somebody's choice. Now, the reason Maimonides did not accept this answer is what we spoke about last week. And we spoke about that there were three major theological issues that Maimonides had with this answer. Again, with the premise of the answer that God knows as a result of our action. Issue number one is that implies that there's constant change in God. Okay, we spoke about that at length last time. That implies that there's constant change in God. In other words, that he's constantly acquiring new information, and the information is affecting him, he's punishing, he's rewarding, he's reacting to that information. That implies change in God. And as we know, the verse says God doesn't change. Even if the verse wouldn't say that, we would know that infinity doesn't change. And so therefore, that's theological issue number one. Issue number two, it implies there's a multiplicity in God, which means each piece of information is unique from another piece of information. Each choice, each action is individual. God collects all of this information. He acquires all of this information. And so God's knowledge is made up of a multiplicity of individual pieces of information. And so that's issue number two, because God's oneness is one that's not made up of parts, as we spoke about at length. And issue number three that Maimonides had is that it implies that God is limited. And so why does it imply God is limited? Because if God can acquire something new, which he didn't have before, that means he was limited. And now you gave him something that he didn't have. that means that he was limited up until that point. And even now that he did get a new piece of information, he's still limited because he doesn't have the futuristic information and so on. And so these are the three issues that Maimonides has with saying that God knows as a result of our action: change, multiplicity, and limitation. Okay, again, if you want at length to understand what we spoke about, you can go back to last week's class. It's on the website, and we spent an hour discussing each one of these 3 points. And therefore, what does Maimonides explain? That therefore you have to come to the conclusion, says Maimonides, that God knows not as a result of our action. So how does he know if it's not a result of our action? So the point Maimonides makes is that God knows from knowing himself. Since God is the creator of all of reality, and creation is not something just of the past, but it's the constant process. So actually everything that happens in creation is the result of God's knowledge. So therefore God, by knowing himself, meaning knowing what he's creating, knowing what he's bringing into being, that's how he knows. He doesn't have to go outside of himself to acquire new information. He finds it within himself. He knows himself by knowing himself. That's how he knows everything that happens. But then that creates the question, if God knows it from within himself, not as a result of our action, where is space for free choice? Where is the room for free choice? And what Maimonides ultimately answers is that since we don't understand God, and God's knowledge of knowing himself is one with God, so in other words, we don't really understand what knowledge means by God. So therefore, the whole question doesn't begin. The whole question only begins, the contradiction is only if we define knowledge as we define knowledge, meaning human knowledge. And human knowledge and free choice, if we would know in advance what's going to happen with absolute accuracy, then there would be no room for free choice. But God's knowledge is one with God. And just as we don't understand God, it's not that we don't understand because we're limited. We don't understand because it's beyond understanding. God is the creator of understanding. God is the creator of knowledge. He is not defined by any definition, definitely not by the definition of knowledge. Therefore, God could technically, what we term as knowing, know, and at the same time, it's a kind of knowledge that doesn't determine and doesn't affect and doesn't influence our choice. That is ultimately, again, I'm saying it in a nutshell, and if you want at length, you can go back to last week's class, but that's in a nutshell what Maimonides addresses. So what's the point? The point being is that Maimonides' understanding of God's knowledge is a knowledge that is not the result of our action. It's a knowledge, so to speak, it's a knowledge that God doesn't have to go to reality to see what's happening. God looks within himself, knows himself, and that's how he knows what's happening. Okay, so what's the problem with Maimonides' approach? What's the question with Maimonides? That's what I want to discuss today, the question and how to address, and how can we answer that question? What is the issue that we can have with Maimonides' approach? Anybody want to suggest something? You would have to unmute yourself first. Nobody. Okay, so while you're thinking, I'll suggest. The issue is twofold. The issue is, it's really a theological issue. It could be a rational question as well, but it makes the question stronger if we address it from a theological perspective. You see, what happens if I can show you clear verses in Scripture that say that God knows as a result of reality? Then that's going to be a clear contradiction to what Maimonides wants to suggest, right? Where do we see these texts? So I'm going to share with you just a few. I'm going to share the screen. If you want to download it yourself and print it out, you can do that on the website, as I mentioned, cocweb.org. It's on the homepage. But I'm going to share it on the screen as well so you can follow along. So we start with quote number 29 on the sheet. Quote number 29 on the sheet is in Genesis 18:21. Anybody recall the story of Genesis 18:21? It's the story with Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay? So in that story, the verse says the following. God is speaking. I will descend now and see whether according to her cry which has come to me, they have done. I will wreak destruction upon them, and if not, I will know. What is the verse clearly saying? I will descend now and see what's happening. And accordingly, I'll know whether they deserve punishment or they don't. If God knows by knowing himself, why does he have to descend and see? He knows it from within himself. The same as when we move on later in the book of Exodus. The Jews are still in Egypt. This is the beginning of the book of Exodus. And they are being persecuted and enslaved. And God says at the end of chapter 2, the Torah says on the end of chapter 2, and they cried out, talking about the children of Israel, and their cry ascended to God from the labor. God heard their cry, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, and God saw the children of Israel, and God knew. Again, this was influenced by the reality. The Jewish people, or at the time they weren't called Jews yet, the Israelites, they cried out, and their cry ascended to God. And that's how God knew. So again, you see here that what happens in reality is what influences, so to speak, God's knowledge. God knows based on reality. And again, you can find many verses throughout Scripture. I'm just going to quote you a few. Number 31, the eyes of the Lord, this is in Zechariah, the eyes of the Lord are roving to and fro throughout all of earth. Again, why does God, whatever that means metaphorically, the eyes of the Lord, but the concept that God is looking is sort of throughout the earth, throughout reality, and acquiring that information. The same as in 32 in Chronicles 2, for the Lord, his eyes run to and fro throughout the entire earth to grant strength with those whose heart is whole towards him. So again, you see this idea of going and looking, and based on that, determining, reacting what to do. So the issue is, from a purely theological issue as well, from a rational issue, but from a theological issue, that Scripture seems to imply clearly that God knows as a result of what's happening in reality, meaning as a result of our actions, as a result of that choice. So the question is, with regard, there's two parts. If we can focus the question on Maimonides individually, but really the question is a broader question. You see, Maimonides has very strong theological arguments, which is, doesn't it cause change? Doesn't it cause multiplicity? Doesn't it imply limitation? Those are very solid questions. At the same time, Scripture clearly says that God knows as a result of what we're doing. So how do you reconcile the two? The question is not really on Maimonides per se. It's just that we're informed by these points through Maimonides. The question is really a broader theological question. How do you reconcile these verses 29 through 32 with the other verses that speak of God not changing, the oneness of God, and God being infinite? Anybody want to suggest an answer? Did I confuse you more? Are they good? Do you understand the issue? Do you understand the question? Because you can't understand the answer if you don't fully understand the question. I don't want to make it a question if it's not a question for you. Yes, Rita. You have to unmute yourself first.
Is the question that if he comes down to see what the people are doing, then he doesn't know. He surmises that there's something going on, but he has to come and see for himself.
Right. So in other words, he knows as a result of what we're doing. If he has to know by looking at us, then that means that he's changed. This new information is different than the way he was before he had this piece of information. That means that he's made up from multiple pieces of information. And that means that he was limited. He didn't have this piece of information before.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we know Rita got the question. Yeah, everyone got it? Are we clear about the question? Okay, so the answer that I'm going to share with you that really reconciles between Maimonides' approach and the approach, as we quoted earlier, I didn't mention them by name, but in the other classes of the Ravid and the Tosfot Yontif and others that are quoted in the source sheet, that they say that God knows as a result of our action. Again, they say it as because of these scriptural sources. So they quote, to support their opinion, they quote these scriptural sources that God knows as a result of our action. Therefore, it doesn't influence our actions. But then how do they address Maimonides' questions of change, multiplicity, and limitation? Maimonides supports himself by these 3 points we mentioned, but how does he then reconcile with scriptural sources? So the answer what we're going to bring is that it's going to reconcile between, they're both right. You know the famous story that a husband and wife once came to the rabbi for marital counseling. And first, the husband came in and complaining about his wife and this and that. And the rabbi listens and says, you know, you're right. You're 100% right. And then the wife comes in and complaining about her husband, a whole list of issues that she has. And the rabbi listens, he says, you know, you're 100% right. And the Rebbitzin, the wife of the rabbi, is sitting and listening in. She turns to her husband and says, I don't understand, honey. How could they both be right? He looks at her and smiles and says, you know what? You're also right. So, you know, as funny as it is, really the beauty of Judaism, the beauty really of academia, is what seems to be a contradiction at face value. It seems to be contradicting opinions at face value. When you can reconcile the two and find a ground where they can both come to an agreement, that's really the beauty and the depth of it. So what I'm going to share with you today is an idea that is shared by, that was explained to reconcile this question by the first Chabad Rebbe. His name was Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi. And in addressing this dilemma, he has a book called, it's written in Hebrew, called Torah Or. And Torah Or is really a compilation of his ideas, as we call them, discourses, on the weekly Torah portion. And it addresses it more from a philosophical and Kabbalistic perspective. So in the Torah portion in Genesis, where it talks about the story of Sodom, is where he addresses this question. Does God know as a result of our action, or does God know before we acted? And his answer is, before we share it inside, I'm going to give you a little quote of what he says. I'm going to use a metaphor to explain what I believe of what he's saying. Now, of course, it's a human metaphor, but in a way we can understand it in reference to God as well. Because really, this question that we present you today could be broadened on a very fundamental theological level. And that is the following. On one hand, if I were to ask you, does God have a body? Is God corporeal? You would, of course, say no. Does God have any form? No. Does God have any definition? Any limitation? Of course, no. Well, then I would pull out scripture and I would start quoting you verse by verse where it implies that God has a form. And it even implies corporeality to God. Let's make man in our image and form. God got angry, loving, kind, compassionate. God sat. God even descended, the verse that we quoted earlier. Let me go down, which are all corporeal things. Spirituality, there's no such thing as going up and down. You ever take an idea of 2 plus 2 is 4 and say, let me take it down from heaven down to earth? It's everywhere. It's simultaneously everywhere. It doesn't take up space. So corporeality is bound by space. God descending, let me see what's happening down there, implies a form of corporeality. God sitting, God nostrils, and so on. We can go through scripture and have the same kind of question of how, on one hand, you speak about this infinite God, you speak about this undefined God, you speak about this incorporeal God, and so on. And at the same time, all of scripture uses humanistic terminology in reference to God, right? So how do you address that question? And really, by addressing that question, in a sense, you're really addressing the question that we're focused on today. So let me use a metaphor to understand this. I think we've used this in the past, but I'll assume that you don't remember what we spoke about. So here's the point. Let's take a human being. Let's talk about ourselves for a second. Any human being, an adult. An adult has a child, a grandchild, a nephew, a niece, a little baby. And you want to engage that child. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Take, in your mind, the greatest adult you can imagine. Whoever it is in your mind, Einstein, the greatest mind. What do you think Einstein did when he wanted to play with this little baby of about 6 months? You think Einstein sat the baby down in a high chair and said, okay, now let me preach to you the theory of relativity? I highly doubt it, right? I believe, I wasn't there, but I assume that he got down on the floor, on the eye level of the child, and began speaking like a little baby, booing and gooing and making the child, right? We all do this, right? That's the way he behaved. Now, if you think about it, somebody that has no understanding of adult-child relationships and dynamics walks into a room and sees this adult on the floor acting and playing like a baby. What do they think about that? Something's wrong. Something is wrong. I mean, if you go into Bellevue, there are many people acting and behaving like children. They really believe that they're a child. It's unfortunate, but it's a reality. So if you don't understand the dynamics, what you see is an adult, you think there's a problem. Actually, if you ask the child, what does the child see in this adult? They see a child in a big body, a child that's strong, powerful, but ultimately a child, right? That's the whole purpose of this engagement. But does it in any way diminish or limit or degrade the adult by acting like a child? Does it make them a child? Absolutely not. On the contrary, actually, it enhances the greatness of the adult that they have the ability, despite the fact that you're an adult, that you can relate to and behave like a child. That to the child, you can be on their level. That you can put yourself in their shoes and engage with them on their level. So what you have here is two realities simultaneously. On one hand, the adult is fully engaged with their child, absolutely fully engaged with their child, 100% focused on their child, 100% present for their child, 100% on the level of their child. In other words, it's not just that they're speaking like a child and behaving like a child, but they're putting themselves in the mind as much as possible in the mindset of the child, right? So they're 100% there on that level. But at the same time, we all agree that they don't become a child. So in other words, there are two realities occurring simultaneously. The adult will always remain an adult at the same time that they're perfectly behaving like a child. And for the child being a child with all the ramifications that come along with that, right? So if we think about this analogy, now think about God. God being the ultimate adult and we being the ultimate child. Which means God being undefined, with all its ramifications of what definition means, and we being ultimately defined, absolutely defined and limited. Now, this God created reality and wanted to have a relationship with his creations. So he can do it in one of two ways. He can do it on his terms. He can be like Einstein, putting his child in the chair and saying, let me preach to you the theory of relativity. Let me be God. So how's the child going to look at this adult? I have no idea what they just said. I have no idea what they want from me. Get me out of here, right? In other words, if God will behave with us as God is himself, we won't be able to relate to God. So what does God choose to do? God chooses to behave with us on terms that we can relate to. God chooses to act, so to speak, like a child. And what happens is that we have here now two, they're both God, the same God. There's no two God, no multiplicity in God. But we have here now two realities. We have a reality of God that, like the adult, always remains an adult, even while they're acting and behaving and in the shoes of a child. They always remain above it and removed from it and an adult mindset, which means, let me just put it in simple terms, if you forgot a little bit what it means. In a child's life, if you stick out your tongue to another child, what are they going to do? He stuck out his tongue to me. I mean, I have children now, right? So we all go through that. He stuck out his tongue to me. Right? In an adult life, if somebody stuck out their tongue to you, what are you going to do? You're going to get upset? I hope not. You're going to think the other guy's crazy. If at 70 years old, you're still sticking out your tongue to me, you got a problem, right? So therefore, but when the parent is acting like a child, and I'm not talking about sticking out the tongue, I'm just giving you the example. You're engaging the child on their level. That means that you relate to sticking out a tongue to a child means it's offensive, it's hurtful, it's bullyish, and so on. You're on that level. In other words, you react accordingly. I don't mean to say you're going to react, you're going to get upset by it, but you understand the message the kid is trying to tell you. If another adult did that to you, or if it wasn't your child that you're trying to engage and they stuck out the tongue, you'll be oblivious to it. It's not important to you. It doesn't exist. It's as if nothing happened. But when you're engaging the child, the good of the child and the negative of the child has an effect on you because you put yourself in the child's shoes. I'll give you another example. Yeah, you walk into every single grandparent's house, every single one across the board. What are you going to see on the refrigerator? Drawings of the grandchildren, right? And that has more value than Shirley's beautiful pictures with the autographs that's behind her. By every grandparent. Am I right or wrong? Absolutely. Right? Why? It's a scribble with a crayon that has nothing. What do you mean it's a scribble with a crayon? It's my grandchild. But if it's somebody else's grandchild, you wouldn't even bend down to pick it up. So in other words, really it has no value. It has absolutely, in itself, you don't relate to it because you're above it. See, in the child's world, it's, I'm such a great artist, look what I've done, look how much I invested in it. But really, for an adult, it's meaningless. But if you choose to engage with that child, if you choose to have a relationship with that child on their level, then all of a sudden it becomes meaningful to you. Then you relate to them on their level. This is what for their level is beautiful. For their level, it's an expression of love. For their level, whatever it should be, all of a sudden you begin to relate and to react. In Yiddish, you say the expression, you kvel. Anybody know what kvels means? I don't know how you translate it. But let's say, I think the simple words, you melt. I don't know if that's like an accurate translation, but a little bit of an idea. So in other words, what am I saying? That there are two realities occurring. There's one person experiencing two realities. There's on one level, the adult as being and retaining their adulthood remains above and aloof and unresponsive to all of that reality. But the part that chooses to engage with the child all of a sudden reacts to what's happening in the child's world. But it's not because inherently they're a child. It's not because inherently the child could have an effect is because they chose to engage on that level. But when they choose, it has a profound effect. At the same time, there's still a level where it doesn't have an effect, where they still retain their adulthood, that it doesn't have an effect. So you have two realities occurring simultaneously. Now, if we think about that within the context of God, it's exactly the same thing. In other words, there's the part of God that's above everything, above any definition, and above reacting to any reality. There is no reality but himself, so to speak. If anything exists, it's because it's part of himself. So at that point, he doesn't need reality to inform him, and he doesn't react to the reality. He determines the reality. He creates the reality. He's above reality. But at the same time, because he created reality, he chose to engage with reality on our terms. And when he chose to engage with us on our terms, he, so to speak, he limits himself to behave, so to speak, on our terms. At that point, he's aware what's happening, and he reacts to what's happening. At the same time, he still retains, so to speak, what we call his essence, his real self that's above it and is not reactive to reality. So there are two things occurring simultaneously. And so therefore, Maimonides, when Maimonides speaks as God's knowledge not being the result of reality, not being reactive to reality, is speaking of the adult, is speaking of God himself, so to speak, speaking of the essence of God, God the way he is by himself. When we have all these other scriptural verses that use humanistic terminology, and the same thing, the scriptural verses that speak about God's knowledge as gaining information from us and reacting to that, is speaking about God when he chooses to engage us on our level. And they're both true at the same time. So let's see that a little bit inside. I think with this analogy, we'll be able to understand it easier. Let's go back to the source sheet. So we'll start with verse 34, quote 34, sorry, I should say, from Job. Quote 34 from Job seems to fly in the face of everything Judaism stands for. If you fail, how do you affect him? If your sins are many, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what have you given him? What can he possibly receive from you? What is Job saying? Whatever we do makes no difference to God. Positive or negative, right? Doesn't that fly in the face of Judaism? What do you mean we have choice and there's consequences, there's reward? In other words, it makes a big difference to God what we do. Our choices make a big difference. He gave us the Torah and he gave us the ability to make choices, and there's consequences. It makes a big difference to God. So how do you reconcile this with Job? So I'm going to quote to you quote number 35 and then 36. In quote 35, this is from Samuel 1. Anybody recall the story at the beginning of Samuel 1? Anybody? I didn't intend this to be a Hebrew school class. But in Samuel 1, if you remember, there was a woman called Hannah. And she was the wife of Elkanah. Elkanah at the time had two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Peninnah had children. Hannah did not have children. She was barren. And she cried. And eventually, she went into the temple. At the time, it was still the tabernacle. And she prayed to God, beseeching God to give her a child. And promised God that if you give me the child, I will dedicate this child to God. And a year later, she gave birth to a child. She named him Samuel, and he became the prophet Samuel. So when she had a child, she went back when the child was old enough, I think it was about 2 or 3 years old, that to thank God for the child and to dedicate the child to God. So she said a certain prayer at the time, and this prayer is a prophetic prayer, which actually has many ramifications in Jewish law about different parts of prayer. But in one of the many verses that she says the following quote, and this is 35 on the sheet. For the Lord is a God of thoughts or of knowledges or knowings. It depends how you translate the word. In Hebrew, it's Kel Deot. Hashem. The Lord is a God of knowledge. But the problem in the verse is that it uses the plural term, thoughts or knowings or knowledges. So if we're talking about God knows many things, then you can use the plural term. But if we're describing God, God is the subject, and this is a description of God as the knowing God, why do we use the plural term of thoughts or knowings? So it implies that there are, so to speak, there's two levels of knowledge within God, so to speak. What does that mean? So quote 36 on the sheet, there are two levels of knowing, God's higher knowledge and his lower knowledge. Again, remember, put it in the analogy we used before. Think of the adult and the child. Higher knowledge being adult, lower knowledge being child. God's higher knowledge is a higher pre-tzimtzum knowledge. I'll talk about in a second what tzimtzum means. A knowledge that is an inseparable part of his seamless self-knowledge. A knowledge that is not caused by, but is the cause of its contents. Right? Remember Maimonides. This was the knowledge Maimonides was speaking about. But then there is a phenomenon known as tzimtzum. Tzimtzum literally means contraction. God is projecting himself in ways that are confining to his infinite and feature-free essence, assuming definitive attributes by which to relate to us on our terms. On this post-tzimtzum level, God knows us with the lower knowledge in a way that is comparable to the workings of a human mind with a knowledge that results from what we do. So this is the answer to the question. God being the adult, and remember, when the adult acts like a child, they still remain the adult. They don't become child. So that means when the adult remains the adult, the unchanging adult, the infinite adult, the one is no multiplicity within the, whatever adult means, God always remains that. Even when he's acting like a child and relating to us like a child, he doesn't become a child. So therefore, Maimonides says, God knows by knowing himself. It's all part of himself. It's all part of his oneness. It's all part of his infinity. He doesn't need to acquire information outside of himself. On the contrary, if there is information outside, it all started from himself. But at the same time, God does choose to engage us as a child. God does choose to engage us on our level. And on that level, God also, so to speak, knows, again, it doesn't affect him. Even when he acts like a child, he relates to the child, he's in the shoes of the child, he understands the child, he reacts to the child, but that's only for the child. It doesn't change him who he is. So therefore, in the relation with the child, there is that level of knowledge that reacts to the child, knows it as a result, reacts to the child, rewards or punishes, and so on as a result of the action. So you have that level which the Raavad and the Tosfot Yontif or the scriptural texts are speaking about as well. Now, what I want to share with you, if we've been clear until now, what I want to share with you is one more point. And I think it's a very important point to make. And it's a very profound idea that I think will be very inspiring as well. And that is that you might ask yourself, if we use the analogy of adult child, you might ask yourself the following question. So that means that the adult, being the adult, and even when they act like a child, they still remain an adult. They don't become a child. So really deep down, doesn't really care about the child. Meaning doesn't really care about the happenings of the child. What the child really doesn't make such a difference. Because really they're adult, they're above it. They're not really affected by it. You see, until now you might say, Rabbi, I thought that if I do a mitzvah, it's very important to God. And if I don't, it's very important. It affects God in a very deep way. And I felt very guilty about it. But now you're telling me that really God's the adult and I'm the child. And then, if I draw the picture, it's really, I'm telling you the secret, but it really has no real intrinsic value. So why am I doing the mitzvah? So why is it really so important? So I won't draw the picture for my grandma. I mean, anyways, it doesn't really make a difference. But the answer is on the contrary. what I want to share with you is the following. That really, what we do is actually more important to God based on this explanation, not less important to God. Let me explain to you what I mean. Let me explain to you in the following way. Let's talk about relationships for a minute. There are two types of relationships. There's a relationship that comes out of necessity, which means, we'll call it in Talmudic language, it's called a conditional relationship. And there's relationship that comes out of choice, which we'll call it unconditional relationship, unconditional love. Now, what do I mean by that? Think of it the following way. Some friendships we make, why do we engage in these friendships? Because we like the person. What do we like about the person? We have common interests. We have common needs. We gain something from that relationship. We feel good about ourselves. We feel happy about ourselves. We feel loved, whatever it should be. In other words, we're engaging in the relationship because there's something that we don't have that we gain by having that relationship, right? That's called a conditional relationship. That's a relationship out of necessity, so to speak. There's a necessity that I feel that I'm missing something. There's a necessity that I feel I can gain something. Both of them is a necessity. Both of them, there's an objective. There's something to be gained by this relationship. But then there's a relationship out of choice, which means I'm not missing anything and I'm not looking to gain anything. So why do I want to have a relationship with you? Because I choose to have a relationship with you. Now, if I choose the relationship, if I love you because of what I'm going to gain from you, do I really love you? Or do I love what I'm going to gain from you? I don't really love you. I love what I'm going to gain from you. I love the qualities that you're going to bring to the relationship, whatever advantages are going to be gained in this relationship. But you yourself, I don't really love you, because if you don't have these advantages and you don't have these objectives, then I'm out of here, right? But a relationship that's by choice. So why am I choosing? Not because. Meaning not because I'm going to gain anything. So why am I choosing to have a relationship? Because that's what I want. So what do I want? I want you. I want to have a relationship with you. So which one is actually a deeper relationship? Out of necessity or by choice? I think it's pretty obvious at this point. By choice. Right? In other words, the unconditional relationship, that's the deeper relationship. So if a child playing with another child, a child reacting to another child, is a relationship out of necessity, which means the reason why you're affected by that child is because you're also a child. You need the child to play with. You need the child to feel good about yourself. You need the social engagement. Whatever you're going to gain, it's on your level. So therefore, if you're a child and you're affected by the child, that's a very limited relationship. But if I'm an adult, I don't need the child. I have nothing to gain by the child. But I choose to have a relationship with a child that has nothing to contribute, and yet I want to have that is the deepest relationship that there is. That is the most profound relationship that you can have. It doesn't, by the way, have to be with a child. It can be with anybody. But I'm just using it in the context of the child. So therefore, if God needed, so to speak, if God's relationship with us would come out of necessity, if God would know because we did, which means ultimately he's on our level, his relationship is out of necessity. He wants us to do a mitzvah because he needs it, because he's missing something, and we're there to contribute something, given that something that he didn't have, that would be a very limited relationship. On the contrary, by God telling us, I'm infinite, I'm perfect, I don't need anything. But even though I don't need anything, I want to have a relationship with you. I'm giving you this mitzvot because this is what I choose, not what I need. This is, so to speak, this is what's going to connect us. I want to have a relationship, and therefore I'm going to give you the tools to have the relationship with me. Then all of a sudden, that relationship is the deepest relationship. And then what you do has the deepest and the most profound effect that it could have. It touches God's, so to speak, essence, and it's connected with our essence. God's relationship with us is not limited to a surface level, to a surface layer of relationship. It's actually the deepest relationship that we can have with God. And so on the contrary, by recognizing that God doesn't need what we do, that he's above it, and yet, even though he's above it, and even though what we do really it can contribute nothing to God, and yet, even so, he chooses to have a relationship with us, and he chooses to give us the mitzvot, and he chooses to say, look, I love you and I want to connect with you. And this is going to be the mechanism through which we're going to build our relationship on. Then all of a sudden, every mitzvah becomes of infinite value. Every mitzvah becomes so deep and powerful. Then we become the most meaningful thing, the most important thing to God. And that is why our relationship with God is compared to parent-child relationship. Because in parent-child relationship, it's unconditional. It's absolutely unconditional. It's the deepest relationship that you can have. And that's what God is telling us, that my relationship with you is not because I need you, it's because I want you. And every mitzvah is recognizing that. So I think I'm going to stop right here. And if you have any questions or comments, or if you want to contradict everything I said until now, feel free. You just have to unmute yourself first.
Rabbi.
Yes.
There are psychologists, I forget who it was specifically, who said that the difference between the mother and the father in the relationship with the child is that it's the mother who really has unconditional love. The father's is more conditional.
That's what the father tells the child. But in reality, that's not true. We all know that. That, you know, as part of motivating a child and disciplining a child, you might exhibit that. The father usually, again, that's painting with a very wide brush, will be usually more the disciplinarian, which means conditional. But it's only it's only on a face value. You know, think of it. What happens if the parent exhibits, so to speak, of being upset with their child, not living up to whatever expectations you placed before them, and then all of a sudden their life is in danger? Will any father say, hey, go to your mother to save you? I'm upset with you at this moment. Right? Any parent will immediately, instantaneously, you know, kick into a different mode. Will put even their own life at risk in order to save their child. So that shows you that it's unconditional on both ends.
Okay.
Okay, have a great evening. And tomorrow morning, 9:30 will be, God willing, Everyday Ethics, 9:30 tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.